Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the harshest winters humanity has ever faced. A season so brutal that it reshaped Europe itself. We're talking about the Great Frost of 1709, the coldest winter in recorded European history. Imagine a world where rivers froze solid, entire harvests failed, and people struggled not just against hunger, but against a cold so intense it felt like the sky itself was trying to crush them. If that sounds fascinating to you, make sure to hit the like button and follow, because this is a story of survival, resilience, and history written in ice. The winter of 1709 didn't just arrive, it struck. For weeks before, Europe had experienced unusually wet weather. Rain and dampness seeped into homes, softened roads, and created conditions where people were already uncomfortable. Then, in January, the temperature plummeted in a way no one could have predicted. Not just a cold snap, this was an assault. From France to Poland, from Italy to Scandinavia, the frost didn't discriminate. Rivers froze, crops blackened in the fields, and entire communities found themselves trapped under snow and ice. But let's not just skip straight to the suffering. To really grasp the magnitude of this winter, we need to understand what Europe looked like at the dawn of the 18th century. This was a continent in transition. The Enlightenment was beginning to shape philosophy, but most people lived rural lives, tied to the land, dependent on seasonal harvests. There were no modern heating systems, no insulated homes, no supermarkets stocked with endless food. Bread, grain, and livestock were the foundations of life. And in January of 1709, all three were suddenly at risk. Picture a small village in France. Wooden cottages huddled together, thatched roofs barely holding under the weight of snow. The Seine River, normally flowing with barges carrying goods, is now a silent sheet of ice. Fishermen stare at frozen waters, powerless. Farmers look at fields where wheat stalks once promised bread, now turned to brittle, lifeless husks. Children cough near smoky hearths, while parents wrap them in whatever scraps of fabric can be found. This was the reality for millions of Europeans that year. Now, the scale of the cold itself is something we can barely imagine. Temperatures dropped to record lows. In some places, they plunged so far below freezing that birds fell from the sky mid-flight, their wings literally frozen stiff. Vineyards in France, famous for their wine, were devastated. Even olive trees in the Mediterranean withered under the frost, something unheard of. The Baltic Sea froze so hard that people could cross it on foot. So why was this winter so extreme? Historians and scientists believe a combination of factors aligned. There was a lull in solar activity, part of what's called the Maunder minimum, where the sun gave off less energy. Add to that volcanic activity, which may have thrown dust into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight. And finally, unusual wind patterns locked frigid Arctic air over Europe for months. All of this collided to create a catastrophe. And catastrophe it was. In France alone, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people died. Bread riots erupted as food prices skyrocketed. Imagine lining up at dawn, hoping for a loaf of bread, only to find there was nothing left to sell. In other regions, people boiled grass or ground acorns into flour just to have something resembling food. Some accounts even describe people tearing the leather from old shoes to chew, desperate for sustenance. But here's where the story becomes not just about suffering, but about endurance. Communities adapted in extraordinary ways. Families burned furniture to keep fires alive. Barns became shared shelters, with multiple families crowding together alongside livestock for warmth. Neighbors pooled their remaining grain, rationing it so that no one starved outright. Every action was deliberate. Every gesture of kindness or resourcefulness could mean the difference between survival and loss. Take, for example, the story of a town in Germany where people began to bake what they called famine bread. It wasn't bread in the way we know it. It was made from a mixture of flour, tree bark, and dried weeds, just enough to fill the stomach and keep people alive. Horrific? Yes, but also a testament to human creativity under unimaginable pressure. The frost didn't just affect ordinary people. Nobles and rulers struggled too. The French court at Versailles, famous for its opulence, found its fountains frozen solid. Ice formed inside the palace walls, and even the aristocracy huddled around fires. Across Europe, governments faced unprecedented crises. Grain reserves were exhausted, trade slowed to a crawl, and armies, already stretched thin from wars, could barely function in the cold. And yet, amid the tragedy, there were moments of strange beauty. Travelers wrote of frozen landscapes that glistened like fields of diamonds under the moonlight. Painters captured villages buried in snow, creating scenes both haunting and serene. For children, the cold meant long days of sledding or sliding across frozen rivers, blissfully unaware of the wider catastrophe. In those moments, the frost revealed itself not just as a destroyer, but as a sculptor of fleeting wonders. So how did people endure 50, 60, even 90 days of this unrelenting cold? The answer lies in routine. Every morning began with the same tasks. Stoke the fire, melt snow for water, check on the animals, ration out a meager breakfast. Each day blurred into the next, a slow dance of survival. And perhaps that's the most powerful lesson of the Great Frost survival. Wasn't about dramatic heroics. It was about persistence, patience, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. When the thaw finally came, the damage was clear. Crops for that year were lost. Livestock herds had been decimated. Prices of grain soared, sparking years of economic hardship. But life did return. Villages rebuilt, families planted again, and Europe continued its march through history. The frost had tested humanity, and while it left scars, it also revealed resilience. Think about it. If you were dropped into January of 1709 with nothing but a cottage, a small fire, and limited food, would you have survived? Would you have found the patience to endure, the creativity to stretch meager resources, the courage to face each frozen morning? These are the questions the Great Frost leaves us with, and they resonate even now, centuries later. Because in the end, history isn't just about kings and wars. It's about ordinary people, parents, children, farmers, travelers who endured the coldest winter Europe has ever known. Their story isn't just frozen in time. It's alive, reminding us that human resilience shines brightest when the world grows darkest. Last time we set the stage for the Great Frost of 1709, Europe's coldest winter on record. We talked about the sudden plunge in temperature, how rivers froze, crops withered, and villages became ice-locked prisons. But that was just the beginning. Tonight, we're going to step deeper into the lives of those who endured it. to see not only how they suffered, but how they adapted in extraordinary ways. If you find this journey fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button and follow so you don't miss the next chapter of history's coldest winter. Now, let's talk about food. In the 18th century, the backbone of survival was agriculture. Families depended almost entirely on what they grew or raised. Bread was the staple, grain the lifeline. But in January 1709, the frost turned that lifeline to dust. Fields that should have been green with winter wheat became brittle graveyards of stalks. Potatoes in the ground froze solid, carrots cracked like glass, and entire orchards, apple, pear, cherry, were wiped out in a single month. Imagine being a farmer, watching not just this season's food disappear, but knowing next year's harvest was gone before spring even arrived. And it wasn't just crops. The animals suffered too. Cows, unable to graze, weakened quickly. Goats, sheep, and even horses died in droves when barns couldn't keep out the relentless cold. Chickens froze on their perches. In France, Italy, and Germany, livestock herds were cut nearly in half. That meant less milk, less cheese, less meat, less wool. Every death of an animal wasn't just a loss of food, but of clothing, of trade, of security. The ripple effects were enormous. With fields and barns barren, markets began to collapse. Grain reserves, meant to feed towns and cities through the winter, emptied fast. By February, prices doubled, then tripled. A loaf of bread became so expensive that ordinary workers couldn't afford it. In Paris, reports tell of people standing in line from dawn, hoping to buy even a handful of flour. And when supplies ran out, anger boiled over. Bread riots erupted. Crowds stormed bakeries. Women shouted at officials in town squares, demanding relief. You can feel the desperation in these accounts, the cry of hunger cutting sharper than the cold. Governments tried to respond. In France, King Louis XIV ordered grain imports and attempted to regulate prices. But the roads were buried in snow, rivers locked in ice. Moving goods became nearly impossible. Couriers froze on their routes. Horses collapsed pulling wagons through drifts. Trade slowed to a crawl. And even when grain arrived, it was never enough. The frost turned Europe into a continent of islands, each village cut off, left to fend for itself. And yet, amid this chaos, human ingenuity flickered. In small villages, people found ways to stretch what little they had. Families boiled weeds, bark, even moss to create thin soups. Acorns were ground into bitter flour to bake what was called hunger bread. In Italy, chestnuts became a staple, roasted or ground into meal. In Poland, villagers melted snow not just for water, but to soften frozen turnips into something edible. Every meal was an experiment in endurance. But food wasn't the only challenge. The frost reshaped faith itself. Churches became sanctuaries in more ways than one. With homes freezing and food scarce, people crowded into chapels, not just to pray, but to warm themselves by communal fires. Priests delivered sermons about divine punishment, some claiming the frost was God's wrath for human sins. Others preached resilience, insisting the cold was a test of faith, a call to unity. Hymns sung in frozen voices echoed through stone walls, creating an eerie mix of despair and hope. Candles flickered on altars, their wax rationed carefully. Bells rang slower, their sound muffled by thick snow, carrying across villages like solemn reminders that time still moved, even when everything else felt frozen. For many, religion became the only thing they could cling to when crops, livestock, and leaders had failed them. Now imagine what travel was like. Roads vanished under snow. Familiar paths disappeared, turning even a short walk between villages into a gamble. Couriers carrying letters often vanished, their bodies later found buried under drifts. Merchants abandoned carts and took to sleds, gliding slowly over ice, animals wrapped in blankets, loads balanced carefully to avoid tipping. Every mile felt like a pilgrimage, every journey an act of courage. And yet trade, though slowed, didn't stop entirely. People bartered more than ever. A family with extra firewood might trade for a handful of dried beans. A farmer with surviving sheep might offer wool in exchange for bread. Markets, though muted and quiet, became hubs of survival, their usual bustle replaced by a measured, cautious rhythm. The frost also shaped culture. Artists painted haunting scenes of snowbound towns, of rivers frozen like glass, of peasants huddled around fires. Writers recorded daily life with a detail that makes us feel the cold centuries later. One diarist in Paris wrote that wine froze in barrels, and when it thawed, it tasted as sour as vinegar. Another noted that people's breath froze into icicles on their beards and hair. These small details capture the humanity of the frost in ways statistics never could. Children, of course, saw the frost differently. For them, the endless snow was both playground and prison. They built forts out of drifts, slid across frozen ponds, and played games indoors with scraps of wood or cloth. But they also learned lessons early, carrying water, helping gather firewood, sitting through long evenings of hunger. The frost shaped a generation, teaching them patience, resilience, and the value of community. So here's the question: what do we take from this today? The Great Frost of 1709 wasn't just a weather event, it was a mirror, showing how fragile society was when nature turned hostile. But it also revealed the strength of ordinary people. They didn't have central heating, supermarkets, or government safety nets. They had each other, and sometimes that was enough. By spring, when the thaw finally came, the cost was staggering. Millions across Europe had suffered. Countless lives were lost. But the frost left behind more than tragedy. It left a legacy of resilience, of communities that discovered strength they didn't know they had. And it reshaped Europe's history in ways we're still piecing together today. Last time, we walked through the frozen villages and hungry markets of 1709, seeing how families bartered, prayed, and stretched every crumb of bread to survive. Tonight, we're going to step into the halls of kings and the crowded streets of cities, because the Great Frost didn't just change daily life, it rattled the foundations of power itself. If you're enjoying this journey through history's coldest winter, hit that like button and follow, because what comes next is where climate collides with politics in the most dramatic ways. Let's start in France. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, was in the twilight of his reign. His wars had drained the treasury, his palaces gleamed while villages starved, and the frost hit his kingdom harder than almost anywhere else in Europe. Fields across France were frozen solid. Grain vanished, bread prices soared, and suddenly, the image of a powerful king basking in Versailles' golden halls looked dangerously out of touch. Reports from Paris tell us of bread riots breaking out in February and March. Crowds of desperate women, often the first to feel hunger because they fed their families before themselves, stormed bakeries demanding flour. Soldiers were called in. But how do you point a musket at a mother holding her starving child? The frost didn't just create hunger, it created anger. And that anger chipped away at the aura of royal power. In fact, historians argue that the Great Frost planted early seeds of discontent that would later bloom into the French Revolution. Think about it. If you're told your king is chosen by God, but then God freezes your crops, starves your children, and leaves you cold in your own home, how long before you start questioning the entire system? Now shift to the Holy Roman Empire. German states were equally devastated. Small principalities scrambled to provide relief, but many simply couldn't. Some towns handed out thin soup from communal kitchens. Others taxed wealthier citizens to buy grain for the poor. But corruption flourished too. Officials hoarded supplies, merchants watered down flour, or mixed it with sawdust to stretch profits. Trust between rulers and subjects frayed under the weight of hunger. England felt the frost as well. The Thames River froze so thick that Londoners held frost fairs on the ice. Imagine tents, games, and even printing presses set up on the frozen river. At first, it looked like a carnival, but beneath the laughter was worry. Shipping routes were paralyzed. Coal deliveries slowed. And when the ice finally thawed, the damage to trade was severe. What had seemed like novelty quickly revealed itself as disaster. And it wasn't only Europe's great capitals that trembled. Small villages across Poland, Italy, and Spain faced famine. In some places, entire communities were abandoned. Families packed up what little they had and walked, searching for towns with food or work. Migration patterns shifted. Labor shortages emerged in certain regions, while other cities swelled with starving newcomers. The frost moved people like pieces on a chessboard, reshaping demographics in ways that lasted long after the ice melted. Religion, too, took on new weight. For many, the frost felt apocalyptic. Preachers thundered from pulpits that this was divine punishment. Some called for repentance, others urged solidarity. Pilgrimages were organized, prayers recited in freezing cathedrals, candles lit until wax itself became scarce. The church became both refuge and stage, a place where people tried to make sense of what seemed senseless. But here's where it gets fascinating. Out of the suffering came science. Natural philosophers, what we'd call early scientists, began to document the weather more carefully. Diaries recorded temperatures, ice thickness, and wind patterns. For the first time, Europe started piecing together the idea of climate as something measurable, something that could be studied, not just feared. The frost spurred curiosity as well as despair. Think also about culture. Artists painted haunting winter landscapes, capturing villages swallowed by snow and peasants huddled by fires. Writers described frost-rimmed windows, frozen wells, and the silence of forests, where even birds had vanished. These works didn't just document hardship, they shaped how later generations remembered it as both tragedy and testament to human resilience. Meanwhile, the politics of food became brutal. In France, some officials tried to fix prices to stop riots, but that often backfired, creating black markets where only the wealthy could buy grain. In Italy, Grain shipments were guarded by soldiers to prevent looting. In Spain, priests were ordered to bless communal ovens so people would believe their bread carried divine protection. Everywhere, hunger forced governments to improvise, sometimes wisely, sometimes cruelly. And through it all, the human stories remained. A widow in Alsace recorded boiling grass to feed her children. A merchant in Venice wrote of watching barges stuck in frozen canals, loaded with grain that no one could reach. A farmer in Saxony described sleeping in his barn to keep his last cow from freezing. These stories remind us that history isn't just kings and treaties, it's real people, caught in forces beyond their control, fighting day by day to endure. By spring, when the thaw finally came, Europe emerged changed. Fields were barren, populations were smaller, trust in rulers was shaken, but communities had discovered new forms of solidarity. Neighbors who once kept to themselves now depended on one another. Families learned skills they'd never needed before: how to ration, how to forage, how to mend endlessly. And across the continent, an unspoken lesson lingered. Power could fail, food could vanish, but resilience had to come from within. So let me ask you this. If you had lived through the Great Frost of 1709, would you have clung to faith, trusted your king, or relied on your neighbors? Maybe all three. But history shows us that when the frost tightened its grip, it wasn't palaces or armies that saved Europe. It was the quiet strength of ordinary people, refusing to give up. And that, in many ways, is the legacy of the Great Frost, not just the coldest winter in history, but one of the greatest tests of human endurance ever recorded. Last time we stood in the frozen streets of 1709, watching kings stumble, peasants riot, and Europe itself shiver under a sheet of ice. Tonight, let's take a step forward, because the frost didn't simply vanish when spring came. Oh no, its shadow stretched across decades, shaping the very foundations of Europe's future. If you find this fascinating, give this video a like and a follow, because the aftermath of the Great Frost is just as dramatic as the winter itself. Let's begin with the harvests that followed. When the ice finally retreated, the land didn't bounce back overnight. Crops had been killed, seed reserves eaten, and livestock reduced. Farmers had to start from almost nothing. Imagine walking into your field in April and seeing not a green shoot in sight, just churned mud and thawing carcasses of plants that never survived the freeze. Many farmers didn't even have seed to plant. They'd eaten it to survive the winter. That meant the following year's harvest was crippled before it even began. This triggered what economists now call a lagging famine. In other words, the hunger didn't stop when the frost melted. It continued, sometimes worse, because reserves were gone. In some regions of France and Germany, people starved more in 1710 than they had during the frost itself. Famine chased famine, and each season became a gamble with survival. Now, think about migration. Families who had lost everything didn't just sit and wait. They moved. Whole communities abandoned villages. Some drifted into cities, swelling poor districts already strained by disease and scarcity. Others crossed borders, seeking work as seasonal laborers. In places like Prussia and Austria, landowners suddenly found themselves with new waves of desperate peasants willing to work for less. The frost didn't just freeze Europe. It shuffled its population like a deck of cards. This reshuffling also fueled conflict. Imagine being a small village already struggling, then watching dozens of new families show up needing bread. Tensions rose. Some towns welcomed newcomers, binding together in solidarity. Others closed ranks, accusing migrants of theft, of spreading disease, of taking what little remained. If you look closely at the records, you see the first sparks of debates about outsiders that echo even today. And then there's the economy. Before the frost, Europe was already strained by wars. Louis XIV had drained France's treasury, England was fighting abroad, and the Dutch were struggling to keep their trade empire afloat. Add in crop failure and famine, and suddenly governments faced bankruptcy. Taxes were raised to pay for food imports. Currencies weakened. In France, debt piled so high that confidence in the crown's finances collapsed. Some historians argue that the frost was one of the nails in the coffin of absolutism, a reminder that even kings couldn't control the weather or guarantee bread. Meanwhile, disease spread. Hunger weakens the body, and cold weakens the immune system. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox followed the frost like shadows. In Paris alone, tens of thousands died in the years immediately after 1709, not from frostbite, but from epidemics fueled by malnutrition. Entire families vanished from the record books, leaving behind empty cottages. But here's where the frost did something unexpected. It sparked innovation. With traditional harvests failing, people experimented. Some turned to potatoes, which tolerated cold better than wheat and rye. Others explored new methods of storage and preservation, smoking, salting, drying to stretch food supplies. Slowly, Europe learned hard lessons about resilience. The frost acted like a brutal teacher, forcing creativity through pain. It also shifted culture. Writers, poets, and philosophers began to reflect on humanity's vulnerability to nature. They asked, if kings and priests can't protect us from frost, who can? These questions chipped away at blind faith in authority. Enlightenment thinkers, already stirring, gained momentum. People turned their eyes from heaven to earth, from superstition to science. And what sparked that? A winter so brutal, it made people doubt everything. Let's pause here and imagine one of those survivors. A child born in 1700 who was 9 years old during the frost. That child saw frozen rivers, empty tables, and mothers weeping. By the time they were 30, they'd watched villages emptied, governments falter, and communities forced to reinvent themselves. By the time they were 50, they were living in a Europe on the brink of revolution. Can we really say the frost wasn't part of that story? Even international politics shifted. Sweden, for example, was in the middle of the Great Northern War against Russia. The frost crushed Swedish troops who were already stretched thin. Soldiers froze in their camps, horses died by the thousands, and supply lines collapsed. Historians argue that the frost contributed directly to Sweden's decline as a European power, opening the door for Russia's rise under Peter the Great. Think about that. A winter storm helping to redraw the map of Europe. And in the countryside, memory lingered. Folk songs were written about the winter of death. Oral tales carried stories of frozen wells, of desperate hunts for food, of miraculous survivals. Parents warned children to always save grain, always mend clothes, always prepare for a winter worse than the last. Generations carried the frost in their bones. shaping habits and fears long after the ice melted. So, what's the big picture? The Great Frost of 1709 wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a historical turning point. It exposed the fragility of governments, reshaped economies, forced migration, fueled disease, encouraged innovation, and maybe, just maybe, nudged Europe closer to revolution. It taught people a truth that still matters today, that resilience comes not from power above, but from patience, solidarity, and the will to endure. Let me ask you, do you think one winter could truly change the course of history? Or is it just one piece of a much larger puzzle? Historians still debate it. But when you trace the threads, you see the frost's fingerprints everywhere, in politics, in science, in migration, in the rise and fall of empires, a season of ice that echoed for centuries. If you've been following along, you know by now that the Great Frost of 1709 didn't just freeze Europe's rivers and fields, it froze an entire generation's hopes. We've seen kings humbled, armies broken, and families reduced to desperate measures. But what if I told you the frost's reach stretched far beyond Europe? If that sounds surprising, give this video a like and a follow, because tonight we're pulling back the curtain on the global echoes of Europe's coldest winter. Let's start with trade. In the early 1700s, Europe was already the beating heart of a global economy. Ships carried sugar from the Caribbean, spices from the East Indies, and furs from North America. But when Europe froze, demand and supply chains twisted in strange ways. For example, grain shortages in France and England suddenly increased the value of imported wheat and rice. Ports in the Mediterranean tried desperately to bring in food, but icy conditions made shipping treacherous. Even the Thames in London was partially frozen, stalling vessels. Imagine being a sailor, staring at docks jammed with ice, unable to unload the very food people were starving for. And then there's the colonies. In North America, winters were already brutal, but reports of Europe's crisis changed priorities. Colonists in New England, who had barely enough for themselves, suddenly faced pressure to export food back across the Atlantic. That meant tighter rations at home, higher prices, and more tension between settlers and indigenous communities, who were already strained by resource competition. A harsh winter in Europe meant harsher policies abroad. The ripple effect reached the Caribbean as well. Sugar plantations depended on steady shipments of food and supplies from Europe. When those ships slowed or failed to arrive, enslaved workers suffered first. Rations were cut, survival became harder, and mortality rose. That's one of the hidden truths of the frost. While Europe starved, its suffering was exported to colonies, where hardship often went unrecorded, except in fragments of letters and shipping logs. Now, look eastward. The frost was not isolated. It was part of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of unpredictable climate shifts that touched continents. In China, records from the early 1700s describe bitter cold, crop failures, and unrest. Rivers froze in regions that rarely saw ice. Was it the exact same weather system? Maybe not. But it was part of a global pattern of cooling that linked distant lands in shared hardship. It makes you wonder, how many forgotten villages in Asia or Africa endured their own great frosts without the chronicles Europe left behind? Another ripple: energy. Europe relied heavily on wood for heat. But when firewood became scarce and expensive, industries dependent on charcoal like ironworking slowed dramatically, production bottlenecked. That had consequences not only locally but across trade networks. Less iron meant fewer tools and weapons shipped abroad. Less linen and wool meant fewer exports to colonies. The frost reached into global commerce like an invisible hand, tightening everything. And then there's the psychological impact. Letters from missionaries abroad reveal how Europe's suffering was interpreted. Some saw it as divine punishment. Others used it as a warning in sermons, even in distant colonies, to preach humility and preparation. Imagine sitting in a wooden chapel in Quebec or Goa, hearing the priest describe the frozen wrath in Europe, and realizing the cold you felt that morning was part of something much larger. The frost became more than weather. It became a narrative, one that shaped faith, politics, and culture across oceans. What about food alternatives? With wheat wiped out, Europe began experimenting with substitutes. Potatoes, as I mentioned before, started to gain ground. But think about how that shifted colonial agriculture too. Suddenly, crops that could survive harsher conditions, maize from the Americas, potatoes from the Andes, gained status as global staples. The frost accelerated a food revolution that reshaped diets on multiple continents. Without it, would potatoes have become the backbone of European survival a century later? Would maize have spread as widely? Here's another piece. Migration overseas. Remember how families fled ruined farms in Europe? Some didn't stop at the next village. They boarded ships. Records show increased emigration to the Americas in the years following 1709. Hungry, desperate, and poor, they sought better chances across the Atlantic. The frost didn't just empty villages, it populated colonies. That means some of the ancestors of modern Americans may owe their presence here to one brutal European winter. Let's not forget science. Europe's intellectuals were already watching the skies, measuring temperatures, and keeping diaries of strange weather events. The frost gave them data, shocking, unforgettable data. Suddenly, weather wasn't just a background nuisance. It became something to study, chart, and maybe, someday, predict. Global knowledge grew from those bitter months as scientists exchanged letters and compared notes across countries. And in art and memory, paintings of frozen rivers in the Netherlands, poems about icy fields in France, folk songs about lost harvests, these became cultural artifacts. And through trade and migration, those cultural memories spread. A French settler in Canada might hum the same mournful tune his mother sang in 1709. A German immigrant in Pennsylvania might recall stories of frost-killed cattle. The frost became a cultural export as much as an economic one. Now, let me ask you this. Do we underestimate the power of climate in history? We talk about kings, wars, and revolutions, but how often do we ask, what about the weather? Could a single winter nudge empires, fuel migration, and reshape global diets? The Great Frost says yes. It reminds us that human ambition always plays against the backdrop of nature, and sometimes nature deals the hardest blow. Last time, we explored how the Great Frost of 1709 rippled across oceans, shaping colonies and trade. But tonight, let's step back into Europe itself. Because once the blizzards eased, once the snow melted into deep rivers of mud, the real question was, how do you rebuild a continent that's been brought to its knees? If you find this journey through history as fascinating as I do, tap that like button and follow, because we're just getting to the heart of the story. When the frost loosened its grip, what was left behind was devastation. Crops hadn't just failed, they were gone. Wheat fields looked like wastelands. Orchards stood with blackened branches, and vineyards across France and Italy had been ruined. Imagine walking into a cellar, expecting barrels of last year's wine, and finding sour sludge instead. For a continent that leaned heavily on bread and wine, that was more than hunger. It was identity stripped bare. Governments scrambled. In France, the monarchy under Louis XIV faced not only the humiliation of military setbacks, but now the rage of starving people. Grain prices skyrocketed. Bread riots erupted in towns. Bakers were accused of hoarding, merchants of gouging. Soldiers were sometimes sent not to fight wars but to guard bakeries. Think about that. Armies reduced to keeping bread lines orderly. And in England, Parliament debated relief measures, while ordinary families mixed ground acorns or tree bark into flour. Diaries mention bread that was bitter, heavy, and barely edible. Yet people ate it, because there was nothing else. Survival pushed dignity aside. Then came disease. Malnutrition weakens bodies, and when weakened bodies crowd together in damp cottages, illness spreads fast. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox all flared in the wake of hunger. The frost was only half the killer. Famine and plague did the rest. Some villages lost a third of their population. In cities, burial grounds overflowed. Bells tolled daily. The sound of mourning became part of the rhythm of life. Yet even in tragedy, resilience flickered. Communities organized charity kitchens where thin soups were ladled out. Churches distributed what little grain they could. Neighbors shared, because isolation meant death. There are records of villages where families pooled animals, keeping a communal cow alive so that children could still have milk. It wasn't prosperity, it was survival through cooperation. Kings and nobles also learned bitter lessons. Louis XIV, who had ruled France like a sun god, saw his authority shaken. The frost revealed that even the most powerful could not control nature. Policies were forced to adapt. Grain storage systems were rethought. Road networks for moving food became a priority in later decades. In a strange way, the cold helped spark modernization not out of vision, but out of desperation. And let's not forget ordinary ingenuity. Farmers experimented with hardier crops. The potato, once mistrusted, gained new acceptance in parts of Germany and Scandinavia. Turnips, hardy and frost-resistant, became livestock feed that saved herds from extinction. Families learned to dry herbs and roots in new ways, stretching supplies further. Every adaptation, small as it seemed, was a thread in the tapestry of survival. But the scars were deep. Economies slowed for years. Families that lost children or elders carried grief that shaped their identities. Songs and folktales preserved the memory of the winter when the world froze. For generations afterward, people measured cold spells against 1,709. If a river froze, they would say, "Not since the Great Frost." It became the standard of suffering. One question historians ask is, did the Great Frost sow seeds of rebellion? Because famine and hardship breed discontent. In France, the anger that bubbled in 1709 never fully vanished. Decades later, when revolutions swept the country, memories of hunger and royal failure played their part. We can't draw a straight line, but we can't ignore the echo either. Hunger has always been history's hidden spark. And in everyday life, routines adjusted. Families built thicker walls, stored food differently, and treated fire as sacred. Winters were approached with more caution. People began preparing in autumn, not just for cold, but for catastrophe. That shift in mindset toward long-term resilience was one of the frost's quieter legacies. Here's something to consider. The frost was nature's reminder that human ambition, armies, and empires mean little if the climate turns against us. We think of history as kings and battles, but sometimes it's the weather that dictates the story. The Great Frost of 1709 is proof. In our last part, we looked at how governments and entire kingdoms scrambled in the aftermath of the Great Frost. Tonight, I want to pull the lens closer. Forget kings and parliaments for a moment. What was it like for the farmer, the baker, the mother sitting by the hearth with her children? What did people write, sing, or whisper to each other during the coldest winter in European memory? If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to hit like and follow. It really helps us keep unearthing these forgotten human stories. Let's start with the diaries. One German pastor wrote that he could see his own breath freezing in mid-air as he spoke to his congregation. He noted that ink hardened in his pen, forcing him to warm it by the fire before finishing sermons. Imagine trying to write a letter with your fingers stiff, the quill scratching across brittle paper while the world outside is silent except for the moan of the wind. In Paris, letters describe families burning furniture to keep warm. Chairs, tables, even heirlooms that had survived generations were thrown into the fire. A noblewoman wrote of weeping as she fed a carved chest once her grandmother's dowry into the flames, saying, "Survival left no room for sentiment." That image alone tells us how desperate times had become. Folk songs also carry fragments of that winter. Peasants sang verses about the sun turned stranger and bread as thin as hope. These weren't grand operas. They were work songs, lullabies, shared around firesides to keep spirits alive. When you sing about your suffering, you make it bearable. When the rhythm of a song matches the rhythm of chopping frozen wood or grinding dry grain, survival becomes a kind of music. Children, too, left their traces. Some drawings survive simple sketches of cottages with smoke and endless snow, stick figures bundled in furs. One child's note mentions frost creeping across the inside of windows like white flowers blooming on glass. It's a hauntingly beautiful description, but behind it is the reality. If frost blooms inside your home, you are living on the edge of disaster. And then there are the stories of hunger. In England, parish records mention families who boiled nettles and thistles when bread ran out. In the Alps, villagers ate leather straps softened in water. One French report even noted that some people roasted cats or dogs. It's uncomfortable to imagine, but famine pushes boundaries we don't want to think about. Yet, alongside the darkness were moments of solidarity. A diary from the Low Countries describes a community sharing a single cow's milk among dozens of children. Each child received just a sip, but the act itself became a ritual proof that they had not given up on one another. Another entry tells of neighbors breaking holes in the ice together, hauling water in shifts through the night. Even exhausted, even starving, they worked as one. Letters also reveal fear of the supernatural. Some people believed the frost was God's punishment. Prayers for mercy filled chapels. Others suspected witches had cursed the land, pointing to the unnatural severity of the cold. Trials were rare by 1709, but whispers still lingered in remote villages. In times of crisis, old beliefs return quickly. And then there were the small victories that lit up the darkness. A father in Saxony wrote of catching 3 fish through the ice and how his children danced as if it were Christmas. Another woman described thawing a single potato and splitting it 5 ways among her family, calling it a feast worthy of kings. These moments sound tiny, almost laughable to us now, but to them, they were life itself. Folklore absorbed the frost too. Legends grew of wolves stalking villages, their howls seen as omens. Some tales claimed the frost itself was a monster, the white giant, or the silver hand that gripped the earth. In telling stories, people made sense of what they could not control. And when the frost finally lifted, those stories remained, passed to children who would one day tell their own. One rhetorical question lingers: what would we have done in their place? Could we burn heirlooms, eat bitter roots, sing against hunger, and still find beauty in frost flowers on glass? Their endurance wasn't glamorous. It was slow, painful, and ordinary. But maybe that's exactly what makes it extraordinary. So as we close this chapter, remember, the Great Frost wasn't just a climate event. It was a human story, written in diaries, sung in folk songs, whispered in prayers, and carved into memory by those who endured. In our last part, we explored the frost through diaries, songs, and personal memories, those fragile, human details that made the cold come alive. Tonight, let's step back and see what happened after the snow finally melted. Because the Great Frost of 1709 wasn't just a season of suffering. It left deep scars on Europe's economy, its people, and even the way nations would move toward revolution. If you're finding this journey meaningful, go ahead and hit like and follow. It really helps keep this channel growing. When the frost finally released its grip, the world it left behind looked nothing like before. Imagine emerging from weeks of silence and snow only to find your fields dead, your orchards blackened, and your barns nearly empty. That was the reality across much of Europe. Grain, already scarce, became outrageously expensive. In France, the price of wheat tripled within months. Bread riots erupted in towns and cities. People weren't rioting for political causes, they were rioting for survival. Governments scrambled. In Paris, the monarchy ordered shipments of grain from distant provinces, but transporting it was slow and costly. In England, poor laws were stretched thin as parishes tried to feed entire communities from dwindling reserves. Some nobles opened their stores to the hungry, earning loyalty. Others hoarded supplies, deepening resentment. You can already see how the frost sowed division. Trade routes collapsed. Rivers that had been frozen for weeks now swelled with meltwater, carrying ruined goods and broken boats. Merchants reported losses not only from spoiled food, but from contracts they could no longer fulfill. Markets shrank, debt grew, and small farmers who had managed to survive the frost now faced bankruptcy. The ripple effects spread far beyond food. Cloth merchants, who relied on flax and wool, struggled when livestock weakened and harvests failed. Breweries closed because barley stores had spoiled, Even salt production slowed, as frozen coasts disrupted the work of salt pans. It was as if every thread of the economy had been touched by frostbite. And with economic strain came migration. Peasants left their frozen villages and walked toward cities in search of food or work. Entire families abandoned small farms, creating swells of displaced people. In Paris, records note an influx of beggars that alarmed authorities. In German states, town leaders tried to turn newcomers away, fearing disease and unrest. But desperation has a way of slipping past walls. The psychological impact was just as deep. When you've survived on roots and melted snow, your trust in stability is shaken. People whispered that God had punished Europe, that another frost might come again. Farmers became cautious, planting extra reserves whenever possible, while households stored food with a paranoia born of memory. The frost had imprinted itself on the European mind. In some regions, adaptation turned into innovation. The potato, already known in parts of Europe, suddenly gained new importance. Unlike wheat, it grew underground, shielded from the worst of the cold. In the decades after 1709, more communities turned to potatoes as a hedge against famine. Ironically, the food that once seemed suspicious or fit only for animals became a cornerstone of survival. But not all changes were so hopeful. In France, resentment of royal incompetence during the frost simmered for years. When bread riots broke out again in the 1782, memories of 1709 gave those protests historical depth. People had long memories of rulers who failed them in the cold. In a way, the Great Frost helped fertilize the ground for revolution 70 years later. Even culture shifted. Painters recorded eerie landscapes of frozen rivers and snow-draped villages. Writers spoke of the winter that swallowed Europe. Folk tales absorbed images of hunger, wolves, and endless white fields. It wasn't just history, it became part of identity. A story parents told children, "We survived the frost, and so will you." And maybe the most haunting consequence was demographic. In some regions, mortality rates rose by a quarter. Entire villages lost elders, infants, or both. Birth rates dropped in the years immediately after, as malnutrition and exhaustion took their toll. Europe recovered, but the scars ran deep. So what do we take from all this? That a single winter can change the course of history. It broke economies, reshaped diets, encouraged migration, fueled political unrest, and planted seeds of revolution. The frost of 1709 wasn't just weather, it was a force that reshaped Europe's destiny. In our last part, we explored how the Great Frost of 1709 broke economies, scattered people across the land, and planted seeds of revolution. But history isn't only written in markets or governments, it's also told in the songs, the rituals, and the small traditions that families created when everything else was stripped away. And that's where we're headed tonight. If you're enjoying this story, drop a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. When the frost finally loosened its grip, daily life did not bounce back overnight. It limped forward. And in that limping, in that struggle, people found new rhythms of meaning. Religion, of course, became a center point. Chapels and churches that had been half abandoned during the worst of the cold were filled again, this time with prayers of gratitude and fear. Sermons spoke of God's judgment, but also of resilience. The frost was remembered as both punishment and test. Families carried rosaries worn smooth by frozen fingers, whispered prayers over thin bowls of soup, and lit candles not just for light, but for symbolic warmth, the flame against the void. Communities adapted traditions in surprising ways. In France, villages began holding winter processions that mixed old pagan customs with Christian. Prayers carrying torches through snowbound streets, chanting hymns, and blessing frozen wells. In parts of Germany, families wove evergreen garlands to hang indoors, not only for beauty, but as a promise that green life would return. Out of desperation came rituals that carried comfort, little pockets of hope woven into the fabric of daily existence. And then there was music. During the frost itself, we spoke about flutes and lutes being played softly by the hearth. Afterward, music became a way to process trauma. Folk songs about the winter spread from village to village. Some were mournful ballads of hunger, wolves, and endless nights. Others were defiant songs, celebrating survival, mocking the frost as if it were an enemy defeated. Imagine a crowded tavern in 1710, mugs raised, voices raw but proud singing, "We froze but we did not fall." Stories too carried weight. Elders, who had survived the frost, became living archives. Around firesides, they told children about the wolves that prowled too close, about bread so hard it broke knives, about neighbors who shared the last crust. These stories were not just warnings, they were lessons in endurance. Children raised on them grew up with a hard kind of patience, a sense that life could tilt into crisis at any moment, and that survival depended not on luck, but on solidarity. Clothing also took on symbolic import. After the frost, communities were obsessed with preparedness. Mothers layered fabrics, stitched wool into every garment, and saved scraps religiously. Quilts were passed down like heirlooms, each patch carrying a memory of that hard winter. Even colors gained meaning. Deep reds and golds were favored, not only for warmth, but because they symbolized life and fire. To wear bright clothes in the years after 1709 was to declare, the frost could not extinguish us. And then, food culture shifted. Where once bread had been taken for granted, it now carried an almost sacred role. Every loaf was sliced. With care, every crumb respected. New recipes emerged, stretching limited supplies, soups thickened with roots, porridges made of barley and potatoes. Families turned necessity into creativity, crafting meals that became tradition in their own right. Many of the humble winter dishes still found in European kitchens trace their roots back to the years after the frost. Communal rituals blossomed too. Market days returned, not with abundance but with ceremony. Sharing even small amounts of food became a gesture of solidarity. A neighbor passing a loaf of bread over the fence wasn't just helping, it was reenacting survival. Weddings, christenings, and funerals gained deeper gravity. To celebrate a birth or a union after such devastation was to defy the frost itself. The frost also reshaped how people thought about time. Before 1709, winter was simply a season to endure. Afterward, it was remembered as a marker of history. Before the frost and after the frost became common ways to describe events. Farmers set aside special granaries, households built larger hearths, and villages organized watch rotations for winters. Memory had been burned into planning, and in art, the frost left its fingerprints. Painters captured eerie white landscapes, dotted with bent trees and blackened orchards. Writers described villages wrapped in silence, broken only by the cry of wolves. Even children's rhymes turned dark, verses about hunger and cold woven into lullabies, as if to prepare the young for hardship by cloaking it in rhythm. In all these ways, through song, ritual, clothing, food, and art, Europe rebuilt its cultural heart after the frost. The memory of suffering was never erased, but it was transformed into resilience. And maybe that's the most human thing about the Great Frost of 1709. It didn't just kill, it also created. Out of its icy grip came new traditions, new foods, new ways of seeing time, and a hardened sense of community. Last time, we talked about how people found comfort in songs, stories, food, and ritual after the Great Frost of 1709. But culture was only one side of the story. This brutal winter didn't just live in memory. It forced governments, farmers, and even scientists to rethink how fragile human survival really was. And if you're finding this journey fascinating, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe so we can keep uncovering these hidden chapters of history together. Now, let's step into the world of power, policy, and discovery. The frost of 1709 hit Europe like a hammer, and for rulers, it was a wake-up call. Grain supplies had collapsed, revolts simmered, trade routes were frozen, and leaders realized that winter wasn't just a season, it was a threat that could topple kingdoms. In France, Louis XIV's court was forced to confront something it rarely acknowledged: hunger on a massive scale. The Sun King, who had built Versailles on excess and luxury, found his subjects rioting over bread. Ministers scrambled to control grain prices, sending inspectors into markets, forbidding hoarding, and even seizing supplies. But here's the twist: every attempt to manage scarcity revealed how fragile the monarchy's grip really was. When bread vanished, loyalty went with it. In Prussia and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, rulers turned to strict rationing systems. Records show meticulous logs of how much grain was stored, how much was distributed, and to whom. Farmers were ordered to keep emergency stores, a policy that would echo in European agriculture for generations. Out of the frost came the first seeds of what we now call food security. Meanwhile, the frost ignited curiosity in another sphere: science. Scholars, priests, and amateur observers all tried to make sense of what had just happened. Why had the rivers frozen solid? Why had birds fallen from the sky? Was it punishment from heaven, or was there a natural explanation? Diaries from the period are filled with careful notes on temperature, snowfall, and animal behavior. For the first time, climate itself became a subject of study, not just folklore. Think about it. Before 1709, people saw weather as local and fleeting. After 1709, thinkers began asking larger questions. Was there a global pattern? Could cold in France be linked to storms in Russia? Was the Earth itself shifting? Some even speculated about a little ice age, though they didn't have that language yet. The frost of 1709 cracked open the door to modern climate science, even if its first steps were slow and uncertain. On the farms, adaptation was immediate. Orchard owners, devastated by trees that had split and blackened, began experimenting with hardier varieties. Grain farmers started planting in staggered cycles, hoping that if one crop failed, another might survive. Some turned to potatoes, a crop that had been eyed with suspicion but suddenly looked like salvation. The frost didn't just kill it, forced innovation. Villages, too, adjusted their systems. Communal granaries were reinforced. Wells were dug deeper. Barns were built sturdier. And families passed down unwritten rules. Never waste. Always prepare. Respect the signs of the sky. These lessons became embedded in rural life, shaping habits for generations. Governments, on the other hand, began using the frost as justification for more control. Taxes were reshaped. Relief measures were tied to loyalty. In some regions, aid was distributed only to those who pledged obedience. In others, rulers tried to soften their image by publicly funding soup kitchens or distributing fuel. The frost became a political mirror, revealing whether a leader saw people as citizens to protect or as pawns to manage. And through all of this, trade itself transformed. The winter of 1709 had shown how dangerous it was to rely on narrow supply lines. Merchants began diversifying routes. Seaports, once frozen, were fortified and reorganized to handle emergencies. Networks that had been fragile became broader, tougher, more flexible. Out of crisis came resilience. But perhaps the most fascinating legacy is this: the frost made Europeans think about time differently. Suddenly, rulers kept weather logs. Farmers tracked planting cycles more carefully. Priests recorded natural phenomena alongside sermons. Memory of the frost wasn't just folklore, it was data. And that data, fragile and scattered as it was, laid the foundation for later scientific revolutions. So here's the bigger question. Was the frost of 1709 just a disaster? Or was it also an unexpected teacher? It broke systems, yes, but it also forced societies to learn, to plan, to innovate, to think about climate as a force bigger than kings or armies. And in that sense, maybe the Great Frost was more than the coldest winter in history. Maybe it was a turning point where Europe began to realize that nature itself could shape destiny. If you've been following this series, you've seen how the Great Frost of 1709 shattered kingdoms, forced farmers to innovate, and even pushed rulers to rethink power. But history isn't only shaped by kings and ministers. It's also written in shaky handwriting, tucked inside letters, diaries, and simple notes from ordinary people who endured that endless winter. Today, let's step into their voices. And before we begin, if you love these glimpses into the past, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps me bring more hidden stories to life. One of the most haunting accounts comes from northern France, where a parish priest recorded the day the wine froze solid in its barrels. He wrote not of policy, but of sound, the cracking of oak staves, the silence of bells muffled by ice, the gasp of parishioners when holy water turned to glass in its font. For him, the frost was not abstract. It was present in every ritual, every prayer, every desperate appeal to heaven. In Germany, a school teacher kept a daily record of his students. He noted their hands too stiff to hold chalk, their ink pots frozen solid before lessons could begin. He wrote about how children huddled together during recitations, sharing body heat, as though knowledge itself required endurance. The classroom became a symbol of survival, a place where learning did not stop, even when every breath clouded the air like smoke. Letters between families capture another layer of emotion. In one, A son wrote to his mother in Saxony, "We have burned the last of the chairs. Tomorrow I will take apart the wagon for wood. If you receive this letter, know that we are alive, though hunger gnaws at us more than the frost." It's brief, almost businesslike, but behind every line is raw fear. Imagine holding that letter, waiting weeks for it to arrive, knowing by the time you read it, the situation might already have changed. Diaries from the Netherlands show how even trade-minded towns suffered. Merchants described canals frozen so thick that entire markets set up on the ice. What might sound picturesque, stalls glimmering under pale winter sun, was in fact survival, disguised as festivity. People skated not for joy, but to move food. Stalls sold scraps, salted fish, frozen loaves. Yet one diarist admitted that in those bleak weeks, laughter still echoed across the canals. Children raced on skates fashioned from bone, and for a moment, hardship was masked by joy. In Poland, farmers wrote of wolves descending closer to villages, their howls blending with the crack of ice. One peasant scrawled in the margins of a ledger, "We are beasts among beasts now." It was less complaint than resignation, a recognition that survival blurred the line between human and animal. Even in cities where walls and wealth offered some protection, diaries reveal quiet despair. A Parisian woman recorded how her fashionable neighbors abandoned silks for layers of wool. She wrote, "No one speaks of elegance now, only of bread." Her words are simple but heavy. They show how frost stripped away vanity, revealing common need. But not all accounts are bleak. Some speak of resilience, even gratitude. A Swiss family's journal records nights when neighbors gathered in a single house, pooling blankets and food, telling stories until dawn. The father wrote, "We are poor, but together, and so the frost cannot take all." That line has survived 3 centuries, a quiet anthem of endurance. These personal voices matter because they show us what statistics cannot. We can say thousands died, crops failed, rivers froze, but in a diary, you hear the sound of boots crunching over brittle snow, or the silence when birds no longer sang. You feel the fear of an empty pantry. You sense the relief of catching a single fish through the ice. History becomes alive, not in grand battles, but in the patience of daily struggle. And here's something powerful. Many of these diaries survived precisely because of the frost. The cold preserved paper and ink. Bundles of letters stored in chests emerged years later, fragile but intact, like frozen voices thawed back into memory. So what do these accounts teach us? That resilience is not abstract. It's in the teacher who insists on lessons despite frozen ink, in the mother who mends garments by candlelight, in the child who skates on bone just to feel joy. The Great Frost of 1709 was not just endured, it was witnessed, documented, remembered. We've walked through the diaries and letters of ordinary people who lived the Great Frost of 1709. But here's something you might not expect. The coldest winter in European history didn't just freeze rivers and kill crops. It also left its fingerprints on art, on music, and on the stories people told. The frost wasn't only endured, it was painted, sung, and written into memory. And before we dive in, if this journey into the human side of history speaks to you, drop a like and hit subscribe. It helps keep these forgotten voices alive. When rivers froze, painters took notice. In the Netherlands, already famous for winter landscapes, Artists suddenly found their world transformed into endless canvases of ice. They painted frozen canals dotted with skaters, makeshift stalls on the ice, and families bundled against the wind. To us, these paintings might look cheerful, almost festive. But look closer behind the rosy cheeks. You'll see thin figures, gaunt horses, and fires lit on the ice itself just to keep people warm. What seems like holiday charm was often desperation disguised as tradition. Even in France, where elegance and fashion usually dominated, the frost seeped into art. Engravings showed carriages stuck in snowdrifts, noblewomen wrapped in layer after layer, their faces peeking from fur hoods. The message was clear: cold did not discriminate. Whether you were a merchant, a farmer, or a courtier, the frost claimed part of your dignity. Art became a mirror of shared vulnerability. Music, too, carried the weight of that winter. In Italy, Vivaldi was composing the four seasons around this era. When you listen to his Winter, with its jagged violins and trembling rhythms, it feels less like background music and more like lived experience. You can hear the teeth chattering, the icy gusts, the brittle crunch of boots on snow. While we can't say he wrote it directly because of 1709, we know he lived through the same Europe gripped by frost. His music resonates as if the violin strings themselves were chilled by icy winds. Folk songs from villages echoed the hardship in simpler but no less powerful ways. In Poland, there are records of lullabies sung about the frost itself, treating it almost as a living spirit, sometimes cruel, sometimes a stern teacher. In France, peasants sang of the year the bread cracked like ice. These songs weren't about beauty. They were survival turned into rhythm, a way to carry endurance on the breath. Writers also turned to words as weapons against despair. In England, newspapers recorded the frost with a mix of awe and alarm. Publishing poems that described the Thames turned into a frozen fairground. Pamphlets spread stories of bonfires on the ice, markets held mid-river, and even weddings celebrated atop frozen surfaces. But behind the novelty, those same pamphlets also warned of famine, of prices rising, of families starving in the countryside. The printed word captured both sides, the spectacle and the suffering. In Germany, sermons delivered in icy churches became a kind of literature in themselves. Ministers wrote homilies comparing the frost to divine judgment, urging repentance. But some struck a gentler note, portraying the winter as a test of solidarity, a chance to show compassion. These texts, copied and preserved, tell us how faith communities turned cold into metaphor, transforming survival into spiritual discipline. And perhaps most fascinating are the small, personal poems and sketches tucked inside diaries. A French woman drew tiny images of frost patterns on her window panes, likening them to lace spun by unseen hands. A Polish student wrote verses about the silence of snow, calling it a hymn too vast for our voices. These weren't meant for public eyes. They were fragments of private endurance, art made in the margins of hunger and cold. What's striking is how often beauty and suffering intertwined. The frost forced people indoors, slowed their pace, and made them attentive to detail. They noticed the way candlelight glowed through ice on glass, or how snow sparkled like crushed jewels under moonlight. They wrote it down, painted it, hummed it. Even as their bodies shivered, their imaginations refused to freeze. In that sense, the Great Frost of 1709 gave us a paradox. While it crushed crops and claimed countless lives, it also sharpened human creativity. Sometimes, the worst conditions yield the most enduring art, not because suffering is noble, but because survival makes every detail of beauty sacred. And this reminds us, history is not just about records of death and disaster. It's also about the poems whispered by firelight, the songs carried across frozen fields, the brushstrokes that captured light on snow. The frost left scars, but it also left echoes of resilience woven into art and music that still speak to us today. Up to this point, we've seen how the frost carved itself into everyday life through hunger, art, and even the smallest routines by the fire. But here's a question worth asking. What did the powerful do during this crisis? When kings, queens, and church leaders looked out over their shivering subjects, how did they respond? Did they open their coffers, or did they tighten their grip? Let's step inside palaces and cathedrals to see how authority tried to control not only the food supply, but also the story of survival. In France, King Louis XIV was nearing the end of his long reign. He had built Versailles as a glittering symbol of control and glory. But by 1709, the Sun King himself was overshadowed by icy skies. Grain prices soared, peasants starved, and riots threatened to spread. Royal decrees poured out ordering grain hoarders to release their stockpiles, restricting bakers from inflating prices, and even regulating the size and weight of loaves. On paper, these measures sounded like compassion. In reality, enforcement was uneven, and black markets thrived. The frost had humbled the monarchy. Even the most absolute ruler in Europe couldn't command the weather. Still, Louis XIV understood symbolism. He staged public appearances in fur-lined robes, distributing bread to the poor in Paris, allowing pamphlets to circulate that praised his fatherly care. But everyone knew the truth. Versailles halls were still warm, while cottages went dark. The crown's gestures were as much propaganda as they were charity, reminding people that the king was watching, that order would be maintained, even if stomachs remained empty. Across the Channel, Britain took a different approach. Parliament debated emergency imports, while London merchants coordinated shipments from abroad. Newspapers covered both the suffering and the government's response, sometimes praising, sometimes criticizing. Unlike France's top-down decrees, England's system spread responsibility across Parliament, local councils, and wealthy landowners. Yet even there, famine relief came too slow for many. Fires were lit in public squares, church collections taken up, and sermons preached about patience and divine testing. In both kingdoms, the frost exposed cracks in authority. No law could thaw frozen rivers or ripen crops buried under ice. Religion carried enormous weight during the crisis. Across Europe, churches became sanctuaries, not only for prayer, but for survival. Cathedrals opened their doors at night so the poor could sleep by communal fires. Monks distributed bread from dwindling stores. Priests preached sermons that framed the frost as both punishment and lesson. Some thundered that sin had brought divine wrath, urging repentance. Others spoke more gently, casting the frost as a call for compassion, a reminder that God's grace was found in acts of care. Candles glowed in frosty chapels, choirs sang hymns that blended sorrow with endurance, and communities clung to rituals that reassured them of continuity. The church didn't just provide food, it provided narrative. By saying, "This suffering has meaning," clergy gave people a way to endure. For the powerful, this narrative was essential. Hunger can spark rebellion, but hunger wrapped in faith could be channeled into patience. Symbolism extended beyond sermons. In Catholic France, processions carried relics through snowbound streets, pleading for mercy from heaven. Statues of saints were draped with furs or garlands of evergreen, a vivid reminder that protection was sought not just from kings, but from the divine. In Protestant lands, ministers organized days of fasting and prayer, urging entire villages to reflect and repent. Even the frost itself became part of religious language. Pastors compared the frozen earth to the hardened heart of sinners, needing warmth from God's love to soften it. Rulers, too, borrowed from this symbolism. Edicts weren't written only in the dry language of law. They were framed as acts of providence, aligning royal power with divine will. In Versailles, scribes described Louis XIV's grain distributions as proof that the king was God's chosen shepherd, providing for his flock. In England, broadsheets portrayed Queen Anne as a steady hand, guiding her people through the storm. These weren't just policies. They were stories crafted to remind the freezing poor that loyalty and patience were still their duty. But people weren't always convinced. Beneath the veneer of ritual and rhetoric, resentment simmered. In Paris, mobs attacked grain convoys, accusing merchants of hiding supplies. In Italy, records show villagers storming storehouses, convinced local lords were hoarding food. Even while churches preached patience, rumors spread that the rich ate lavishly while the poor starved. Authority struggled to maintain legitimacy, caught between symbolic gestures and the reality of empty stomachs. Yet propaganda had power. Paintings commissioned during and after the frost often showed rulers handing out food, their benevolence frozen in oil and canvas. Pamphlets recounted not the failures but the triumphs, how the monarchy endured, how faith communities gave hope, how the frost was survived not in spite of power, but because of it. We know better now, reading between the lines. But at the time, these stories shaped memory. It's worth asking, what keeps people loyal when their world is crumbling? Sometimes it's bread. Sometimes it's faith. But often, it's the story they're told about their suffering. In 1709, rulers and clergy alike became storytellers, crafting narratives of endurance, sacrifice, and divine order. They couldn't stop the cold, but they could try to control the meaning of it. And this leaves us with a haunting truth. The Great Frost wasn't only a natural disaster, it was also a test of power. How rulers reacted, how churches preached, how stories were spun, all of it determined whether people saw themselves as victims of chaos or as participants in a shared, meaningful trial. We've walked through palaces where kings tried to hold their image together, and chapels where priests gave meaning to the frost. But history isn't only written by rulers. Sometimes, it's whispered by villagers around the fire, shaped by fears, hopes, and the mysterious power of imagination. So let's step out of Versailles, away from Parliament, and into the cottages, fields, and markets, where folklore and superstition turned the Great Frost into legend. When nature lashes out, people search for reasons. In 1709, ordinary villagers didn't have meteorological charts or scientific explanations. They had stories. Some whispered that the frost was punishment sent by God, yes, but others insisted it was the devil's work. Tales circulated of shadowy figures, wandering frozen roads, cloaked in mist, leaving behind fields of withered grain. Children were warned to stay close to the hearth, for the frost itself was alive, an invisible hunter that stole warmth with every breath. In the Alps, some said mountain spirits were angry, stamping their icy feet until rivers froze and avalanches thundered down. Along the Rhine, fishermen told of a white lady who glided across frozen waters at night. If you saw her veil flutter in the moonlight, it meant famine would claim your village. Were these stories true? Maybe not in a literal sense, but they were true in another way. They gave shape to a terror people couldn't explain. Superstition found its way into daily routines. Farmers left breadcrumbs at crossroads for wandering spirits, hoping to soften the frost's grip. Mothers hung sprigs of evergreen above doorways, symbols of life defying death, whispered to keep evil away. Candles weren't just practical, they were talismans. Families believed if a flame burned steady through the night, their house would be spared from sickness. If it flickered wildly, danger was near. Even animals became part of the lore. In Poland and Hungary, villagers believed that if roosters crowed too early, it meant the frost would worsen. Cats curling by the fire were seen as guardians, their steady breathing protecting the household. And wolves drawn closer to villages by hunger were feared not only as predators, but as omens. A wolf's howl on a frozen night might mean death was coming for someone in the house. Folklore also gave people heroes. In some parts of France, stories spread about a winter saint, a humble shepherd who braved the snow to deliver food to starving families. In Italy, peasants told of Madonna figures weeping ice instead of tears, protecting the faithful from famine. These weren't official church teachings, they were grassroots myths, born out of desperation and shared like embers of hope. Markets buzzed with rumor as much as with trade. Some swore certain wells were cursed, their waters turning sour with frost. Others whispered that witches had conjured the cold, jealous of prosperous harvests. Old women with knowledge of herbs were eyed with suspicion, accused of bargaining with the frost in exchange for survival. In times of fear, suspicion always finds a target. But not all stories were dark. Children invented games to make sense of the strange world outside. They built little figures from ice, calling them snow spirits, and imagined that if the spirits melted, spring would come faster. Songs were improvised, simple rhymes about fire, bread, and the promise of sunlight. Laughter, even quiet laughter, was itself an act of resistance, proof that imagination could survive where crops could not. The frost also crept into dreams. Diaries from the period mention strange visions, people dreaming of endless fields of white, or of doors they couldn't open, or of tables where food disappeared before it could be eaten. These weren't just nightmares. They were collective expressions of anxiety, the subconscious writing its own folklore. And when those dreams were retold in kitchens and taverns, they became part of a shared cultural memory. It's striking how quickly superstition and practicality intertwined. A farmer might ration hay with precision, but also slip a charm under his animal's bedding. A mother might sew patches carefully on her children's coats, but also whisper a protective prayer into each stitch. Was it rational? Not entirely. But in a world where the cold itself felt supernatural, blending faith, folklore, and survival was a way to reclaim control. And here's something worth reflecting on. Centuries later, historians study the frost with graphs and data, but the people who lived it didn't experience it as climate change or atmospheric pressure. They experienced it as a living presence, angry spirits, divine tests, omens written in the snow. That's how folklore works. It's not about accuracy. It's about making fear speak a language the heart can understand. Even after the thaw, these stories endured. Grandparents retold them to children on winter nights. The tale of the frost that cracked church bells, the saint who fed the poor, the wolves that sang death at the edge of the village. The Great Frost became not only history, but myth, a symbol of endurance, caution, and the thin line between life and death. So when we talk about 1709, we're not only talking about crops and kings, we're talking about imagination. The frost froze rivers and fields, but folklore kept human spirit flowing. And maybe that's the secret. Survival is not only about bread and fire, it's also about stories, about giving meaning to hardship, about whispering to yourself in the dark, "This too will pass." Hey guys, today let's take a different step forward. Up to now, we've been deep inside the frozen grip of 1709. The silence, the superstition, the way survival itself slowed to a rhythm of patience. But all winters end, no matter how brutal. And when the thaw finally came, it didn't bring instant relief. It brought revelations. The snow melted, the rivers loosened, and the frost retreated. But what it uncovered was both sobering and transformative. Imagine the first days of thaw, icicles dripping like slow clocks, roofs groaning under the weight of melting ice, roads reappearing in muddy, uneven lines. After weeks of white silence, the sound of water returned, dripping, rushing, flooding. For many, it was the sweetest music they'd ever heard. But relief quickly mixed with dread, because as the snow vanished, it exposed the scars. Fields that once promised harvests now lay ruined. Wheat that had frozen solid never recovered. Orchards cracked, bark split wide open as if trees had been torn in battle. Vineyards, especially in France, were devastated. Centuries-old vines, proud lifelines of villages, stood blackened and brittle. Farmers walked their land like mourners in a graveyard, touching ruined trunks and realizing entire livelihoods had vanished beneath the frost. And the floods came. The ground, hardened for months, couldn't drink the sudden rush of meltwater. Rivers swelled, carrying away bridges and washing through towns. In some places, waterlogged fields turned into marshes. What had been parched by ice was now drowned by flood. Imagine surviving the winter only to watch spring sweep away the little you had left. Hunger deepened. Whatever grain or vegetables had been hidden in root cellars were spoiled by rot. Reserves were exhausted, and new crops couldn't be planted fast enough. Families chewed bark, boiled weeds, and stretched the last scraps of flour. Diaries speak of bread mixed with straw, of soups so thin they were barely more than warm water. This wasn't a feast of renewal, it was the harshest hunger gap, the cruel bridge between survival and the promise of next harvest. Markets reflected the desperation. Prices skyrocketed. A sack of grain that had been affordable in autumn now cost months of wages. Poor families simply couldn't compete. They bartered tools, clothing, even heirlooms for a handful of rye. And when there wasn't enough, theft rose. Authorities cracked down, punishing people for stealing bread. But what choice did they have? What would you do if your children cried with hunger and the only food was locked away behind a merchant's stall? Communities that had pulled together in the cold now faced division. Some villages pooled seeds and worked together to plant spring crops. Others broke under the pressure, each family fending for itself. Old grudges surfaced. Neighbors accused one another of hoarding. Suspicion fell on anyone who had survived too well. In famine, survival itself can look like a crime. But spring also brought something else: mobility. Roads cleared, rivers thawed, and people began to move again. Refugees, beggars, and displaced families filled the routes, searching for food, work, or charity. Churches reported an influx of the desperate. Cities faced waves of rural poor arriving with hollow eyes and empty hands. Suddenly, hunger wasn't an isolated problem in each village. It was visible, collective, and undeniable. And with visibility came unrest. In France, protests and food riots broke out. Bakers' shops were attacked, granaries stormed, and markets disrupted by angry crowds. In Italy and Spain, similar tensions simmered. The frost had stripped bare the fragility of social contracts. People had always known winter was hard, but the Great Frost showed that rulers, markets, and even nature itself could fail them all at once. The cultural shock was immense. For decades afterward, songs and proverbs remembered 1709 as the year of hunger, the year wolves came to town, the year bells cracked. Parents warned children about waste, about the thin line between feast and famine. Even recipes carried the memory dishes, designed to stretch scraps. Soups built on weeds and bark were passed down as lessons in resilience. Yet, not all was loss. In the ashes of famine came innovation. Farmers experimented with hardier grains and crops less vulnerable to frost. Potatoes, once mistrusted in parts of Europe, began to gain acceptance. They could survive colder climates and produced more food per acre. It's no coincidence that in the century after 1709, potatoes spread widely across Europe. The frost, in its cruelty, forced people to rethink agriculture. Communities also re-evaluated charity. Churches, once slow to organize aid, learned the importance of storing grain and preparing for famine years. Mutual aid societies formed in some regions, early seeds of what would later become cooperatives and relief networks. Pain had reshaped not only diets, but also the way people thought about responsibility and resilience. And then there was the psychological shift. For months, people had lived under the belief that the frost was divine punishment, witchcraft, or a supernatural curse. But spring revealed another truth. Nature was indifferent. It wasn't personal. It was brutal, yes, but not targeted. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant the world was unpredictable. Liberating because it nudged society toward looking for explanations beyond superstition. Slowly, science gained ground. Observers began recording temperatures, studying crop resilience, and asking questions not only of priests, but of natural philosophers. The thaw, in other words, didn't just melt ice. It melted illusions. It revealed weakness in economies, exposed inequalities, and challenged old beliefs. But it also revealed strength, how far people could go with patience, with community, with sheer determination to endure. So, what do we take from this? maybe that survival is not the end of the story. What comes after survival, the rebuilding, the reckoning, the reimagining, is just as important. The Great Frost of 1709 didn't end when the snow melted. It lingered in fields, in prices, in folklore, and in memory. It left Europe forever changed. If in the last part, we talked about the thaw, the ruined crops, and how spring revealed just how deep the scars ran, then now we need to face the next brutal chapter, famine. Because hunger doesn't fade the moment the snow melts. In fact, for many across Europe, the hunger of 1709 truly began after the frost was gone. Think about it. The cold had already wiped out fields, cracked orchards, and destroyed grain stores. When spring came, there was nothing waiting to grow. No reserves left in the barns. No healthy seed in the ground. Families had clung to life through the winter on scraps and rationing. But now, with nothing to harvest, famine tightened its grip like a vice. Prices soared. Grain markets, already strained, spiraled into chaos. A loaf of bread in Paris that might have cost a few sous the year before suddenly cost 3, 4, even 5 times as much. For laborers and peasants, it was impossible. They couldn't earn fast enough to match the inflation. Imagine standing in a crowded market, clutching your last coin, only to realize it wouldn't even buy a crust of bread. And markets weren't just about food. They became battlegrounds of desperation. Riots erupted across France, Italy, and parts of Germany. In some towns, crowds stormed bakeries, dragging loaves into the streets. In others, they intercepted carts of grain, convinced merchants were hoarding or smuggling food away. Rumors spread quickly, sometimes true, sometimes fueled by fear that the wealthy were locking up supplies while the poor starved. Authorities responded harshly. Soldiers were sent to guard bakeries. Rioters were beaten, arrested, even executed. But could force stop hunger? Could punishment silence the stomachs of thousands? The frost had not only killed crops, it had exposed the fragile trust between rulers and the ruled. In France, the Sun King, Louis XIV, already aging and weakened, saw his prestige crumble. His wars had drained the treasury, and now famine made people question the crown's ability to protect its subjects. When bread disappeared, loyalty disappeared with it. You could say that the frost put cracks in the very foundation of absolutism. Elsewhere, similar tensions rose. In Italy, food shortages triggered unrest in Naples and Florence. In Spain, weakened by years of conflict, famine struck hard, deepening resentment against elites and foreign rulers. Even in England, where the frost was severe but less catastrophic, grain prices leapt high enough to trigger public anger. People began to ask, why should survival depend on the whims of weather, or the hoarding of merchants, or the indifference of kings? And then there were the stories, those haunting, personal accounts that bring the statistics to life. In the Rhineland, a chronicler wrote of families boiling nettles and bark for soup. In Flanders, travelers described gaunt children with swollen bellies wandering villages. In northern France, mothers left infants at church doors, hoping someone with more food might save them. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the daily rhythm of life in 1709. Religion played a powerful role. Churches overflowed with the starving, not only for food but for answers. Priests preached patience, calling the frost a test from God, a punishment for sin, or a reminder of humility. But not everyone accepted those words quietly. Some whispered darker thoughts. If God allowed such suffering, maybe kings and priests weren't his chosen after all. That seed of doubt, planted in the hunger of 1709, would grow in the decades ahead. And then there were the wolves. Driven by hunger themselves, they crept closer to towns. Chronicles speak of packs roaming villages, attacking livestock, even people. Imagine being a child, already hungry, already afraid, and now hearing howls outside your door at night. The line between civilization and wilderness blurred, and for many, it felt like nature itself had turned hostile. But amid the suffering, something else took root: rebellion. Food riots weren't just chaos. They were the first stirrings of popular resistance. In France, angry crowds shouted not just for bread, but against taxes and corrupt officials. In Italy, peasants demanded fair prices, challenging merchants openly in the streets. These weren't revolutions yet, but they were rehearsal. The frost had turned hunger into fury, and fury into courage. Let's pause and ask, why does famine so often lead to rebellion? Because hunger is the great equalizer. You can endure taxes, war, even oppression, but when your children cry from hunger, fear becomes anger. When survival itself is at stake, obedience breaks. That was the hidden legacy of 1709. It didn't just freeze rivers and kill crops, it froze the old bonds of loyalty and cracked them wide open. Even governments that survived the immediate crisis had to adapt. Some began stockpiling grain reserves, others invested in infrastructure, trying to ensure food could move faster in future winters. In Prussia, Frederick I recognized the need for stricter organization of relief. And in Austria, imperial officials began keeping more detailed agricultural records. The frost had taught a brutal lesson. Nature could cripple nations as surely as war. And yet, let's not miss the human side. Communities, despite riots and divisions, also pulled together in remarkable ways. In small villages, neighbors shared seeds, helped each other rebuild barns, and rotated fields to maximize what little survived. Oral traditions from rural France tell of families who adopted orphaned children from starving households. In Poland, nobles reportedly opened their granaries to peasants not out of pure kindness, but because they realized their estates would collapse if the peasants perished. The frost tested every bond family, neighbor, faith, and ruler. Some broke, some strengthened, but none emerged unchanged. So by the time summer of 1709 arrived, famine was everywhere. Wolves had prowled, riots had erupted, and kings had been shaken. The frost had ended, but its echo was loud and clear. It had revealed that Europe was one bad winter away from collapse. In the last part, we stood inside the markets and the homes of ordinary villagers, where hunger turned to anger and riots shook the trust between rulers and their people. But now let's pull back and look at the bigger picture. How the great frost of 1709 rattled entire economies, disrupted trade, and forced kings and ministers to face truths they had long ignored. Because here's the thing, winter didn't just freeze rivers, it froze commerce. The arteries of trade roads, canals, and waterways were choked with ice. Ships trapped in harbors, barges locked in rivers, carts stalled in snow. Imagine being a merchant in Amsterdam, staring at your warehouses full of goods, unable to move them a mile down the road because the world outside had turned into an endless wall of white. The Dutch, famous for their maritime trade, faced disasters as canals froze and cargo spoiled. England's Thames, solid with ice, cut off London's port traffic. The Baltic, already a treacherous sea in winter, became a prison of floes, halting the timber and grain trade that Northern Europe relied upon. Even wine merchants in France watched their barrels crack open in the cold, rivers of spoiled vintage running across frozen cellar floors. Money itself began to lose meaning. What good were coins if no food was left to buy? Inflation spiraled. A sack of grain might double in price within a week. Farmers who still had reserves became reluctant to sell, waiting for prices to climb higher. Urban workers, those who lived hand to mouth, were the first to suffer. Their wages couldn't keep up. Entire industries slowed or shut down, not just because of cold, but because their workers were too hungry or too weak to labor. And yet, in strange ways, the frost created winners as well as losers. Wealthy merchants who hoarded grain and released it slowly made enormous profits. Nobles who controlled estates with surviving livestock found their value doubled overnight. Some shipowners, when the thaw came, charged outrageous fees to carry even the smallest cargo, knowing demand was desperate. Governments tried to intervene, but often stumbled. In France, officials imposed price controls on bread, forcing bakers to sell at lower rates. But bakers couldn't afford flour at inflated prices, so they simply stopped baking. Shelves went empty, lines grew longer, and riots grew fiercer. In England, Parliament debated poor relief, but local parishes were overwhelmed. One winter might drain a community's resources for years. Diplomacy also froze under the weight of winter. The War of the Spanish Succession was raging, and armies across Europe suddenly faced an enemy stronger than any general: cold. Soldiers deserted in droves, not from fear of battle, but from lack of food and fire. Horses, essential for cavalry and transport, died by the thousands. Supply lines collapsed. Campaigns planned for 1,709 stalled or failed outright. Leaders realized that even their wars bent to the will of the weather. Think about that irony. Kings spent fortunes on cannons, muskets, and fortresses, but a single winter storm could undo it all. In France, Louis XIV faced not only a hungry population, but also armies too weak to fight effectively. In the East, Sweden's Charles XII, already deep in conflict with Russia, saw his forces battered by the cold, contributing to the disastrous defeat at Poltava later that year. Can we really say the frost didn't help redraw the map of Europe? Economists of the day, though they wouldn't have used that word, took notes. Pamphlets circulated, debating whether reliance on single crops was dangerous, or whether governments should store grain reserves for emergencies. Some thinkers argued that Europe needed to diversify food sources, bringing in more maize and potatoes from the New World. Others saw the frost as divine punishment, insisting no amount of planning could outwit God. But quietly, the seeds of modern agricultural policy were being planted in the ashes of hunger, and the ripple effects kept spreading. Artisans who worked with fabrics saw wool shrink and crack in the cold, making production costly. Tanneries froze, delaying leather supplies. Even salt, vital for preserving food, clumped into frozen masses. Inns and taverns, once centers of community life, struggled to serve travelers who no longer came because the roads were impassable. The economy didn't just slow, it changed shape. Meanwhile, the psychological economy, the invisible current of trust and confidence, collapsed. People began hoarding more, distrusting markets, distrusting officials, distrusting even neighbors. When trust in trade breaks down, communities retreat inward, and isolation grows. The frost, in many ways, made Europe smaller. Each village a fortress, each household a world unto itself. But necessity breeds invention. In the aftermath, new methods of food preservation emerged. Families experimented with salting, drying, and storing crops in cellars lined with straw or insulated with clay. Merchants pushed for better roads, stronger carts, and more reliable storage facilities. Governments, humiliated by their failures, invested in granaries and transport reforms in the decades that followed. And let's not forget culture. Writers, diarists, and chroniclers captured the frost's economic devastation in vivid detail. French peasants left behind letters begging relatives for flour. Italian priests recorded lists of families who received church bread rations. English pamphleteers warned against greedy merchants. These weren't just economic notes. They were cries of a society realizing how fragile the entire system was. Here's a question to sit with. Was the Great Frost of 1709 the first modern economic crisis in Europe? It had inflation, hoarding, shortages, riots, government intervention, and speculation. It sounds eerily like later famines and even financial crashes. Maybe what happened in those icy months wasn't just a weather disaster. Maybe it was a glimpse of the vulnerabilities built into an interconnected, growing Europe. And kings noticed. Louis XIV, his glory dimmed, began losing control of his narrative. Frederick I of Prussia looked for ways to strengthen state management of food. Across the continent, ministers quietly admitted that survival depended not just on God or nature, but on human planning. The frost had dragged Europe, unwillingly, one step closer to modern governance. So by the end of 1709, when the worst of the frost had passed, Europe stood shaken. Fields ruined, markets broken, armies weakened, and treasuries drained. But also less visibly new ideas simmered about resilience, about planning, about the power of ordinary people when hunger turns to fury. We've been walking through frostbitten fields and struggling markets, but now it's time to look at something deeper, the way the Great Frost of 1709 reshaped not only bodies and bellies, but also souls and imaginations. Because when nature strikes with that much force, people don't just respond with shovels and rationing. They respond with stories, with prayers, with art, and with meaning. Across Europe, churches filled even as pantries emptied. Priests stood in frozen pulpits, their breath visible in the air, preaching about divine punishment, warning that the cold was God's anger for sins left unrepented. Congregations listened with a mixture of fear and hope. Was this judgment? Was this a test? Or was it simply nature, indifferent to human frailty? In Catholic France, processions were held through snow-choked streets, candles flickering in the wind as men, women, and children prayed for mercy. In Protestant lands, ministers emphasized discipline, endurance, and moral reform. The same frost, but different interpretations. One focusing on divine wrath, another on human duty. And in homes, ordinary people turned their fears into ritual. Families lit extra candles at night, not only for warmth, but as symbols of hope. Superstitions flourished. Some believed that hanging herbs above the hearth could keep sickness from the door. Others buried charms in frozen soil to warm the earth back to life. Mothers whispered old lullabies that spoke of spring's return, songs passed down from grandmothers who had endured past winters. Every household created its own small universe of meaning to push back against the silence and the cold. Artists, too, could not ignore what was happening outside their windows. Painters began to capture landscapes unlike anything they'd seen before. Frozen rivers with ships trapped like toys. Villages buried under drifts. Only chimney smoke proving life still stirred below. Some works, especially in the Netherlands, even romanticized it. They painted ice fairs, crowds skating, stalls selling hot drinks, turning a catastrophe into something picturesque. But beneath the charm was an unspoken truth. This was not just a winter scene. This was survival, dressed in beauty. Writers recorded the frost in diaries and pamphlets. French peasants wrote to distant relatives, "Our bread is stone, our wine is ice, and we live only by God's hand." English journalists described Londoners skating on the Thames with both wonder and unease. Italian priests chronicled the names of the dead in long lists that filled church records, each name a quiet testimony to the frost's reach. And yet alongside despair, there was poetry. People began to use the language of cold and endurance as metaphors for strength. The frost became a symbol, a reminder that life could be fragile, but also astonishingly stubborn. And then there was music. Imagine sitting by a hearth, the wind howling outside, while someone pulls out a lute or flute. The notes are quiet, deliberate, almost fragile in the cold air. Songs weren't about grandeur, they were about calm. Gentle hymns, slow dances, lullabies that soothed children to sleep. In villages where words sometimes failed, melody carried hope. Even silence itself, broken only by crackling wood or distant wolves, became part of the rhythm. That quiet was terrifying at first, but gradually it turned into something meditative, even holy. The frost also inspired moral reflection. Pamphleteers and philosophers debated what the winter revealed about society. Some argued that greed, hoarding food, inflating prices was the true enemy. Others saw charity as the highest virtue, insisting that survival wasn't just about one family's firewood pile, but about how neighbors looked out for each other. In fact, many communities reported small miracles. A family sharing its last loaf with another, a stranger bringing firewood to a widow, children pooling scraps of food for animals. These stories became part of the moral folklore of the frost, retold for years after, reminders that compassion can be as powerful as endurance. Religious art, too, absorbed the frost. Painters depicted Christ shivering on the cross against a backdrop of snow. Saints were imagined trudging through icy landscapes, blessing fires and hearths. Even the imagery of hell shifted in some sermons, not flames, but freezing. Priests described eternal punishment as endless ice, a reflection of the suffering people already knew in their bones. And what about identity? For many Europeans, the frost became part of their collective memory. French villagers spoke of le hiver terrible for generations. In Germany, people remembered which rivers froze and which towns endured. In Italy, Records of frozen olive groves marked a cultural wound, as much about identity as about agriculture. Survival became a badge of honor. Families told children, "Your grandfather survived the frost of 1709. It was a way of saying, "We are tough, we endure, and so will you." Even politics borrowed from this cultural shift. Monarchs used religious ceremonies to frame themselves as protectors of their people. Louis XIV ordered public prayers. Other rulers declared days of fasting or thanksgiving when the frost eased. These weren't just gestures of piety, they were attempts to control the narrative, to remind people that kings still stood between them and chaos. But the truth was, the frost had exposed their limits. No crown could stop the cold. That awareness seeped into Europe's consciousness, slowly fueling the idea that perhaps rulers were not divine, but simply human. And finally, let's not overlook imagination. The frost inspired myths and legends. Children whispered about ice giants roaming the forests, about spirits that froze wells and fields. Some said witches had cursed the land. Others believed angels tested humanity's patience. These weren't just fairy tales, they were ways of making sense of the senseless, of turning cold into a story rather than just a brutal fact. So when we think about the Great Frost of 1709, we shouldn't only see frozen crops and starving families. We should also see candles glowing in windows, songs whispered around fires, paintings of frozen rivers, and stories that helped people endure. It wasn't just a winter. It was a cultural event, a spiritual reckoning, and a creative spark that shaped how Europeans thought about hardship and resilience. If you've been following along, we've already walked through frozen fields, darkened chapels, and quiet hearths. But here's the thing, what happened in the Great Frost of 1709 didn't just vanish when the ice melted. The legacy of that winter carried forward for years, even decades, reshaping how Europe thought about food, power, and survival itself. First, let's talk about farming. The frost of 1709 devastated crops in ways people hadn't seen before. Wheat froze in the ground. Vines, especially in France, shriveled beyond repair. Olive trees across Italy split open under the ice, leaving groves dead for generations. When spring finally came, fields that should have been green were barren. Farmers stared at cracked earth and broken stalks, realizing the year's harvest had been lost before it even began, and that had consequences. Bread prices skyrocketed across France. In some regions, loaves cost 4 times what they had the year before. Poor families who had barely survived the winter now faced famine. They lined up at bakeries, scraping coins together, hoping for even the smallest piece. It wasn't just hunger, it was humiliation, watching wealthier neighbors buy food while their own children starved. Doesn't that sound like a recipe for unrest? You bet it was. In fact, many historians point to the frost as one of the sparks that fueled resentment, leading toward the French Revolution decades later. When peasants remembered suffering through 1709, they didn't forget that the king and nobility seemed insulated from it. The cold was universal, but the pain wasn't shared equally. That memory simmered beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to ignite. Beyond France, the frost exposed just how fragile Europe's food systems really were. Trade routes froze literally. Rivers locked in ice. Roads blocked by snow. Suddenly, Regions that depended on imported grain were cut off. Southern Italy, usually rich in produce, struggled when their olive groves died. Northern Germany, reliant on Baltic trade, saw shipments stall. This wasn't just a bad season, it was a warning. If one winter could choke the lifelines of trade, then no nation was truly secure. And governments took notice. In the years that followed, rulers invested more heavily in grain storage, in granaries that could last multiple seasons. Some even encouraged crop diversification, urging farmers not to rely solely on wheat or vines. The frost didn't just destroy food, it changed the way Europe thought about food security. It planted seeds of a more cautious, more prepared society. But the frost also reshaped politics. Remember how monarchs staged prayers and ceremonies during the freeze? Well, that wasn't enough to convince everyone. People began to wonder, if kings could not protect their subjects from cold, what good were they? That subtle doubt fed into a broader skepticism of absolute monarchy. The frost became one of those quiet cracks in the foundation of royal power, a reminder that rulers were human, not divine. In England, the winter played into debates about trade and empire. If local harvests failed, then overseas colonies became even more important. Sugar from the Caribbean, grain from Ireland, fish from Newfoundland, all of these resources gained new weight in the minds of English leaders. The frost, in a strange way, reinforced the urgency of empire, showing that survival at home could depend on supply lines abroad. And what about ordinary people? The psychological scars ran deep. Diaries from across Europe reveal how villagers remembered the frost for decades. Parents told children, "You do not know hunger until you've lived through 1709. The phrase itself became shorthand for hardship. Just like today, we might reference the Great Depression as a symbol of struggle. In 18th century Europe, the frost of 1709 became a benchmark, a way of saying, we endured the worst, and we survived. That kind of memory shaped culture. It made people more cautious, more frugal, more attuned to the fragility of life. It also made them more resilient. Communities that survived learned that cooperation mattered more than ever. Sharing food, pooling firewood, watching each other's animals, these weren't just acts of kindness, they were survival strategies. And those strategies became habits, passed down as lessons for the next generation. The frost even touched science. Think about it. When people saw rivers freeze solid, crops die instantly, and livestock collapse in snow, they wanted answers. Scholars began to study weather more seriously, recording temperatures, mapping patterns, and debating causes. Was it punishment from God? Or was it something natural? Something that could be observed and explained? The seeds of modern meteorology were watered, ironically, by ice. Art and literature also absorbed the frost's legacy. Poets wrote about endurance, about fire and frost as symbols of life and death. Painters continued to depict icy landscapes, not just as pretty scenes, but as reflections on fragility. Even folk songs changed. In rural France and Germany, ballads about the hard winter circulated for decades, telling stories of families who survived, of neighbors who shared, and of the bitter cold that humbled kings and peasants alike. One of the most fascinating legacies, though, was migration. Some families, ruined by the frost, abandoned their farms. They packed what little they had and moved to cities, seeking work where food was more available. Others looked overseas. Colonies in the Americas suddenly seemed more appealing, warmer, fertile, less likely to freeze solid overnight. In this way, the frost didn't just change Europe, it helped shape the movement of people across the world. And then there's the human heart. After the frost, people valued simple things differently. A warm loaf of bread, a blanket well mended, a neighbor's helping hand. What had once been taken for granted became treasures. Isn't it strange how loss clarifies value? The great frost stripped life down to essentials, and when spring returned, those essentials felt more precious than ever. So, when we look back at the frost of 1709, we're not just looking at a brutal winter, we're looking at a turning point. It was nature's reminder that Europe was vulnerable. It was a teacher, forcing innovation in farming, trade, and science. It was a critic, exposing inequality and shaking faith in monarchs. And it was a poet, leaving behind stories, songs, and memories that outlasted the ice itself. We've traveled together through frost-covered villages, frozen rivers, silent chapels, and snow-buried fields. And now we've reached the final chapter of our journey into the Great Frost of 1709, the coldest winter in Europe's recorded history. By now, you can probably feel it in your bones, the way that winter pressed down on every soul, from the richest palace to the poorest cottage. But here's the part that always amazes me. The frost didn't just crush lives. It carved new paths. It forced people to reimagine survival, to lean on one another, and to carry lessons that stretched far beyond the thaw. When we think of history, we often picture kings, wars, and empires. Yet the Great Frost reminds us that sometimes it's the weather, the raw hand of nature, that shapes the destiny of nations. France, already burdened by Louis XIV's endless wars, saw famine and unrest rise directly from frozen fields. England learned to value its colonies more deeply because local harvests couldn't be trusted. Italy's shattered olive groves changed diets and trade for decades, and peasants across Europe quietly carried the memory of hunger, a memory that would later ignite revolutions. But the frost wasn't only destruction, it was a teacher. It taught communities that strength came not from isolation, but from cooperation. It taught families that every stitch, every log of wood, every shared meal mattered. It taught leaders that the loyalty of their people was fragile, that promises of divine right meant little when children starved. And it taught scholars that weather itself was worth studying, worth recording, worth understanding. From that winter, the seeds of meteorology began to grow. And let's not forget the human heart. Diaries, songs, and folk tales all tell us the same thing. People remembered the frost less for its cruelty than for the moments of light inside it. The neighbor who shared bread, the grandmother who told stories by the fire, the child who laughed while playing with shadows on the wall, even as the wind howled outside. Those are the memories that survived alongside the hunger and the grief. So what does this mean for us today? We may not fear rivers freezing solid or olive groves splitting under ice, but we still face our own storms, economic crises, pandemics, climate change. And just like in 1709, survival often depends less on individual strength and more on community, patience, and care. The frost reminds us that resilience isn't loud or flashy. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just tending the fire a little longer, sharing the last loaf, or holding on to hope through the darkest nights. As we close this series, picture the final scene of that long winter. The snow is beginning to melt. The rivers are starting to move again. Smoke rises from chimneys, not as desperate plumes, but as steady signs of life. Families step outside, blinking against the sunlight, knowing that they have endured something extraordinary. And though their world is scarred, it is also renewed. That's the legacy of the Great Frost of 1709. Not just the suffering, but the endurance. Not just the cold, but the warmth people created in spite of it. A reminder that even in the harshest seasons, life presses forward. So tonight, as you rest, let the story of that winter settle around you like a blanket. Think of the villagers who survived by sharing, of the songs sung by the fire, of the candles glowing softly against the dark. Let it remind you that no matter how heavy the cold feels, whether in weather, in history, or in your own life, warmth can always be found. Close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let that sense of quiet resilience carry you into sleep. May your dreams be calm, your heart steady, and your night filled with comfort. Good night, my friends. Sleep well. And remember, just like those who endured the coldest winter in history, you too carry the strength to weather any storm.